Sometimes the most ordinary Tuesday can become the day that changes everything. When substitute teacher Margaret Collins walked into Roosevelt Elementary, she had no idea she was about to become the voice for a child who desperately needed someone to believe in him. What started as a simple act of defending a student with a disability would uncover a secret so profound it would shake an entire community to its core. The parents' revelation didn't just change one classroom. It changed how we see courage, truth, and the power of standing up for what's right. This is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about judgment, compassion, and the hidden struggles families face behind closed doors. If this story moves you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more inspiring content, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes, defending one child means defending the truth itself. Margaret Collins had been substitute teaching for 15 years, but she'd never encountered a situation quite like this one. At 62 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose, Margaret had seen just about everything a classroom could throw at her. She'd handled unruly teenagers, anxious kindergartners, and everything in between. But walking into Mrs. Henderson's third-grade classroom at Roosevelt Elementary that crisp October morning, she sensed something different in the air. The regular teacher had called in sick with the flu, leaving behind detailed lesson plans and a note about the students. Most of the instructions were standard math worksheets, reading time, lunch procedures. But there was one note that caught Margaret's attention. Please keep an eye on Tommy Martinez. He can be disruptive and requires extra patience. Margaret folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. She'd heard similar warnings before, usually about children who were acting out for reasons the adults around them didn't fully understand. In her experience, the so-called difficult children were often the ones who needed the most understanding. The morning started routinely enough. 23 third-graders filed into the classroom, their backpacks bumping against desks as they settled into their seats. Margaret introduced herself with the warm smile that had made her a favorite among students and principals alike across 3 different school districts. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mrs. Collins, and I'll be your teacher today, while Mrs. Henderson gets better. I've heard wonderful things about this class, and I'm excited to spend the day learning with all of you. Most of the children responded with the typical mix of curiosity and politeness that substitute teachers usually receive. But Margaret's attention was drawn to a small boy sitting in the 3rd row, 2nd seat from the window. He had dark hair that seemed to have a mind of its own, deep brown eyes that held an intelligence beyond his years, and a slightly anxious expression as he fidgeted with the corner of his notebook. This had to be Tommy Martinez. As the morning progressed, Margaret began to understand what Mrs. Henderson's note had meant. Tommy struggled to sit still during the reading lesson. His leg bounced under his desk, and he occasionally made small vocal sounds. Not quite words, but little noises that seemed to help him concentrate. When Margaret asked the class to work quietly on their math problems, Tommy's pencil tapping became more pronounced, creating a steady rhythm that some of his classmates found distracting. "Tommy," whispered Sarah Chun, the girl sitting next to him, "you're being too loud again." Margaret watched as Tommy's face flushed red. He immediately stopped tapping his pencil and pressed his lips together tightly, as if he were trying to hold back the sounds that wanted to escape. His whole body tensed, and she could see the effort it was taking him to stay quiet and still. What struck Margaret most was not Tommy's behavior, but the way the other children and even some of the parent volunteers who came in and out of the classroom looked at him. There were eye rolls, exasperated sighs, and whispered comments that clearly made the boy feel like he was constantly doing something wrong. During recess, Margaret decided to observe from the playground rather than retreat to the teacher's lounge, as many substitutes did. She watched as Tommy stood by himself near the swing set, occasionally flapping his hands in a rhythmic pattern while watching the other children play. When a ball rolled near his feet during a kickball game, he picked it up and threw it back. But none of the other children acknowledged his help or invited him to join. The real trouble started after lunch. The class was working on a science project about the solar system. Students were supposed to work in groups of 4 to create a poster about one of the planets. As Margaret began organizing the groups, she noticed that when she called Tommy's name to join a group, the 3 other assigned children immediately looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Collins said Brandon Weber, a boy with freckles and a confident demeanor that suggested he was used to getting his way. "Do we have to have Tommy in our group? He's weird and he'll mess up our project." Margaret felt her jaw tighten. "Tommy will be an excellent addition to your group. He has wonderful ideas to contribute." But Brandon wasn't finished. "He makes those weird noises, and he can't sit still. My mom says he's not normal, and that's why he doesn't have any friends." The classroom fell silent. Margaret could see Tommy's shoulders slump as he stared down at his desk. Several other children were looking back and forth between Brandon and Tommy with expressions that ranged from curiosity to discomfort. A few were nodding in agreement with Brandon's assessment. This was the moment Margaret later realized had changed everything. Instead of simply redirecting the conversation or giving Brandon a mild reprimand about being kind, Margaret made a decision that would ripple through the entire school community. She walked over to Tommy's desk and knelt down beside his chair so they were at eye level. "Tommy," she said gently, "would you like to tell the class about some of the things you're really good at?" Tommy looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. No teacher had ever asked him that question before. He glanced around the room at his classmates, then back at Margaret. I don't know," he whispered. "Well, I'll tell you what I've noticed today," Margaret said, standing and addressing the entire class. "Tommy, when we were reading this morning, you knew every single vocabulary word. You finished your math problems correctly and faster than most of the class. During our discussion about weather patterns, you made connections that showed you really understand how nature works." She paused, looking directly at Brandon, and then at the other children who had been nodding along with his cruel assessment. "Sometimes people's brains work differently, and that's not weird. That's wonderful. Tommy's brain might process things in ways that look different from how yours works, but that doesn't make him less smart or less valuable. It makes him unique, and unique is something we should celebrate, not criticize." Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "But he makes those noises and stuff." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, he does. And you know what? Some people need to move their bodies or make sounds to help their brains focus. Just like some people need glasses to see clearly, or some people are left-handed instead of right. Everyone's body and brain has its own way of working best." She walked over to Brandon's desk. "Brandon, I noticed that you chew on your pencil eraser when you're thinking hard. Does that help you concentrate?" Brandon looked down at his pencil, which indeed had bite marks on the eraser. "I guess so. And Sarah," Margaret continued, turning to the girl who had asked Tommy to be quiet earlier, "I saw you twirling your hair around your finger during our reading time. Did that help you focus on the story?" Sarah nodded sheepishly, her hand automatically reaching up to touch her hair. "We all have things we do to help ourselves think and learn better. The difference is that some of these things are more noticeable than others, but that doesn't make them wrong." Margaret returned to Tommy's side. "Tommy, would you be willing to be my special helper today? I think your attention to detail would be perfect for helping me organize our science materials." For the first time all day, Tommy smiled a genuine, bright smile that transformed his entire face. The rest of the day went more smoothly. Margaret made sure to call on Tommy several times during discussions, and she was right. His answers showed depth and creativity that impressed even his skeptical classmates. During the science project, she strategically partnered him with Emma Rodriguez, a kind girl who had been watching the earlier interaction with obvious sympathy. But it was at the end of the day that everything truly changed. As the children were packing up their backpacks and getting ready for dismissal, Margaret heard raised voices in the hallway. She asked Emma to watch the class for a moment and stepped outside to investigate. Near the main office, she saw Tommy standing with his head down while a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive-looking clothes spoke in harsh, clipped tones to Principal Johnson. Margaret recognized her as Mrs. Weber, Brandon's mother, and one of the most influential parents in the school's PTA. "This has gone on long enough," Mrs. Weber was saying. "That Martinez boy is disruptive, and it's affecting my son's ability to learn. Brandon comes home every day talking about the weird noises and behaviors. It's not fair to the normal children to have their education compromised because the school refuses to deal with problem students." Principal Johnson, a kind man in his 50s, who had always supported inclusion and diversity, looked uncomfortable but was clearly trying to maintain diplomacy. "Mrs. Weber, Tommy is a bright child who deserves the same educational opportunities as every other student. We're working with his family to ensure he has the support he needs while also maintaining a positive learning environment for everyone. Support. Mrs. Weber's voice rose. The support he needs is to be in a special classroom with other children like him, not disrupting normal kids who are trying to learn. Margaret felt her hands clench into fists. She was about to step forward and give Mrs. Weber a piece of her mind when she heard another voice, quieter but filled with unmistakable pain. "Excuse me." Everyone turned to see a woman approaching from the parking lot. She was petite, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing scrubs that suggested she'd come straight from work. Margaret immediately recognized the resemblance. This had to be Tommy's mother, Mrs. Martinez, Principal Johnson said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you for coming." Mrs. Martinez looked at Mrs. Weber with a composure that Margaret found remarkable given the circumstances. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I think there are some things you should know about my son." Mrs. Weber crossed her arms. "Look, I'm sure he's a nice boy, but nice doesn't change the fact that he's disruptive and doesn't belong in a regular classroom." "You're right," Mrs. Martinez said quietly. "Tommy is different. He has autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and sensory processing challenges. Those noises he makes, they're called vocal stims, and they help him regulate his nervous system so he can focus better. The movement you find so distracting. It's how his brain stays organized and ready to learn." She paused, and Margaret could see her gathering strength for what came next. "But there's something else you should know. Something I haven't shared with the school because I wanted Tommy to be seen for who he is, not for what he's accomplished." Principal Johnson leaned forward. "What do you mean, Mrs. Martinez?" "Last month, Tommy was tested by a team of educational psychologists and child development specialists. The results came back 2 weeks ago." Mrs. Martinez reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "My son, the one you want to banish to a special classroom, has an IQ of 156. He's profoundly gifted." The hallway fell silent. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Mrs. Martinez continued, her voice growing stronger. "He sees patterns that adults miss. He understands mathematical concepts that aren't usually introduced until high school. He reads at a college level and has been teaching himself Spanish and French using online resources. His behaviors aren't signs of a problem. They're signs of a brilliant mind trying to function in a world that doesn't understand how it works." Mrs. Weber's face had gone pale. That can't be right. Gifted children don't act like that." "Actually, they often do," Mrs. Martinez replied. "Twice exceptional children, those who are both gifted and have learning differences or disabilities, are more common than most people realize. Tommy's autism doesn't cancel out his intelligence any more than your son's need for glasses cancels out his ability to see." She turned to Principal Johnson. "I've been homeschooling Tommy in the evenings to keep him challenged because I know the regular curriculum isn't meeting his needs. I've been working 3 jobs to afford the specialists and therapists who help him navigate a world that sees his differences as deficits instead of just differences." Margaret stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "I've been Tommy's substitute teacher today, and Mrs. Martinez is absolutely right. Your son demonstrated knowledge and insight that impressed me all day long. He was respectful, helpful, and kind. The only disruption I witnessed was other people's inability to see past their own prejudices." Mrs. Weber looked back and forth between Margaret and Mrs. Martinez. But the noises, the fidgeting, or how he manages his sensory needs so he can access his incredible intelligence," Margaret said firmly. "I've been teaching for 15 years, and I can tell you that Tommy is one of the brightest children I've ever worked with. What he needs isn't a special classroom. He needs understanding, accommodation, and probably more advanced academic challenges." Mrs. Martinez nodded. "The testing team recommended that Tommy be evaluated for the gifted and talented program, but they also stressed that his sensory and attention needs must be supported, not eliminated. He's not broken, and he doesn't need to be fixed. He needs to be understood." Principal Johnson was looking through the documents Mrs. Martinez had handed him, his eyes widening as he read. "These scores are remarkable. Mrs. Martinez, why didn't you share this information with us sooner?" "Because I wanted Tommy to have a chance to be seen as himself first," she said. I've watched too many bright children get pigeonholed into being either the disabled kid or the gifted kid without anyone recognizing that they can be both. I wanted his teachers to get to know his heart and his character before they knew about his test scores. She looked directly at Mrs. Weber. Your son, Brandon, is a smart boy, too. I'm not trying to diminish that. But intelligence comes in many forms, and kindness is just as important as any test score. Maybe instead of trying to exclude children who are different, we could teach our kids to see those differences as opportunities to learn something new about the world. Señora. Weber was quiet for a long moment, her expression shifting from defensive anger to something that looked almost like shame. I didn't know. Brandon just comes home talking about the disruptions, and I assumed— You assumed that different meant less than, Margaret said gently, but firmly. It's a common mistake, but it's one that can cause real harm to children like Tommy. Mrs. Martinez reached into her purse again and pulled out a small notebook. This is one of Tommy's journals. He writes stories and observations about the world around him. Would you like to read a few entries? She handed the notebook to Mrs. Weber, who opened it hesitantly. As she read, her expression continued to change. Margaret couldn't see the pages, but she could see Mrs. Weber's face softening. He wrote this, Mrs. Weber asked quietly. Last week, Mrs. Martinez confirmed. It's a story about a boy who sees colors in music and hears melodies in mathematics. It's his way of describing how his mind processes information differently than other people. Mrs. Weber closed the notebook carefully. Mrs. Martinez, I owe you and Tommy an apology. I let my frustration and ignorance cloud my judgment. I made assumptions that were unfair and hurtful. She turned to Principal Johnson. I think we need to have a parent education meeting about neurodiversity and twice exceptional children. If Tommy's experience is what I think it is, there are probably other children in our school who are being misunderstood too. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she had become a teacher in the first place, to advocate for children who needed someone to believe in them. Principal Johnson nodded enthusiastically. That's an excellent idea, Mrs. Weber. And Mrs. Martinez, I'd like to schedule a meeting with you, Tommy's regular teacher and our gifted education coordinator, to discuss how we can better support Tommy's unique needs. As the group began to disperse, Mrs. Martinez approached Margaret. Thank you, she said simply. Tommy came out of school today talking about how his substitute teacher made him feel smart and important. That hasn't happened in a long time. Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. Tommy is an extraordinary child. Any teacher would be lucky to have him in their classroom. Would you? Mrs. Martinez hesitated. Would you be interested in tutoring Tommy occasionally? I can't afford much, but I think he could really benefit from working with someone who sees his potential. Margaret didn't hesitate. I would be honored. And please, don't worry about payment. Sometimes the most important work we do isn't about money. As Tommy emerged from the building with his backpack, Margaret watched his face light up when he saw his mother talking with her. Mrs. Collins! He called out, Are you going to be my teacher again tomorrow? Not tomorrow, sweetheart, but I hope I'll see you again soon, Margaret replied. Remember what we talked about today. You have a brilliant mind and a kind heart. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Tommy grinned and gave her an unexpected hug before running to his mother's car. As Margaret walked to her own car, she reflected on how one day had changed so much. She had walked into Roosevelt Elementary thinking she was just covering for a sick teacher. Instead, she had become part of a story that challenged assumptions, revealed hidden truths, and reminded everyone involved that our differences are often our greatest strengths. But the story wasn't over yet. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. The next morning, Margaret received a phone call from Principal Johnson. Mrs. Collins, I know you're scheduled to substitute at Jefferson Elementary today, but would you be willing to come back to Roosevelt instead? Mrs. Henderson is still sick. But more importantly, the Parents Committee has requested that you lead a discussion about inclusive education practices. It seems word has gotten out about what happened yesterday. Margaret smiled. As she changed her route toward Roosevelt Elementary, sometimes one moment of standing up for what's right creates ripples that spread far beyond what we ever imagined possible. When she arrived at the school, she found something she hadn't expected. Taped to the classroom door was a hand-drawn picture signed by all 23 students in Mrs. Henderson's class. In the center was a figure with silver hair and glasses, clearly meant to be her, surrounded by children of all different appearances and abilities. At the top, in Tommy's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for teaching us. The different is wonderful." Margaret carefully removed the picture from the door and held it close to her heart. In all her years of teaching, she had never received a gift that meant more. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself thinking about Tommy and his family more than she had expected. She had returned to Roosevelt Elementary twice more to substitute for Mrs. Henderson's extended recovery, and each time she was struck by the gradual but noticeable changes in the classroom dynamic. The parent education meeting that Mrs. Weber had suggested turned into a series of workshops attended by nearly every family in the school. Margaret had been invited to share her observations about neurodiversity in the classroom, and she was amazed by how hungry the parents were for information and understanding. During one particularly moving session, Mrs. Weber stood up in front of 40 other parents and shared what she had learned. "I realized that my son Brandon was coming home upset not because Tommy was disrupting his learning, but because he didn't understand why Tommy was different, and neither did I. When children don't understand something, they often fear it or reject it. But when we gave Brandon the tools to understand autism and giftedness, he became one of Tommy's strongest advocates." That statement proved prophetic in ways no one could have anticipated. 3 weeks after the initial incident, Margaret received another call from Principal Johnson, but this time his voice carried an urgency that made her immediately concerned. "Senora Collins, we have a situation here that I think you should know about. It involves Tommy Martinez and some of the other students. Can you come in today? Even though Mrs. Henderson is back?" Margaret's heart raced as she drove to Roosevelt Elementary. Had the progress they'd made somehow fallen apart? Had Tommy's differences become a source of conflict again? When she arrived at the school, Principal Johnson met her at the front door, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Come with me to the gymnasium," he said. "There's something you need to see." As they walked down the familiar hallways, Margaret could hear voices coming from the gym. Lots of voices, all talking excitedly. When Principal Johnson pushed open the double doors, Margaret stopped in her tracks. The gymnasium was filled with students, parents, teachers, and community members. At the center of it all was a large display board titled "Celebrating Neurodiversity in Our Community." Around the board were dozens of posters, each one featuring a different child or adult and highlighting their unique abilities and challenges. But what took Margaret's breath away was the poster front and center. It featured a professional photograph of Tommy smiling confidently at the camera. The title read, "Tommy Martinez, future scientist, current friend, always amazing." Mrs. Martinez appeared at Margaret's elbow. "Surprise!" she said softly. "This all started because of what you did that day in the hallway." "I don't understand," Margaret sighed, still staring at the displays. "What is all this?" "It's the first annual Roosevelt Elementary Neurodiversity Celebration," Principal Johnson explained. "After the parent workshops, Mrs. Weber and several other families approached me with the idea. They wanted to create an event that celebrates all the different ways our students' minds work." Mrs. Weber appeared on Margaret's other side. "We realized that Tommy's story wasn't unique. Once we started really listening to our children and paying attention to their struggles and strengths, we discovered that many families were dealing with similar challenges in silence." She gestured to the displays around the room. "We have children with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, anxiety disorders, and various forms of gift. We have kids who are twice exceptional, like Tommy, and others who are neurotypical but have their own unique talents and challenges. The point isn't to categorize or label, it's to celebrate the full spectrum of human neurodiversity." Margaret walked closer to Tommy's display and began reading the information his mother had provided. Alongside his school achievements and test scores were photos of elaborate Lego constructions he had built, examples of his creative writing, and testimonials from his tutors about his remarkable ability to see mathematical patterns that even they sometimes missed. But the most powerful part of the display was a section titled, "What Tommy Wants You to Know," written in his own words. "My brain works differently than most people's brains, but that doesn't make it broken. I see colors when I hear music, and I can feel the patterns and numbers like they're alive. Sometimes I need to move my body or make sounds to help my brain focus. Just like some people need to tap their feet or chew gum, I know I'm different, but I'm also kind, smart, and a good friend. I hope other kids who are different like me will know that they're not alone, and that different can be beautiful too. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she read Tommy's words. She turned to find him standing quietly beside her, looking up with those same intelligent brown eyes that had captured her attention that first day. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "did you know that Albert Einstein probably had autism too? And Temple Grandin, who designs humane systems for farm animals? And maybe even Mozart?" Margaret knelt down to his level. "I did know that, Tommy. There have been many amazing people throughout history whose brains worked differently from the majority." Tommy nodded seriously. "Mom says that maybe my differences aren't things to hide or be ashamed of. Maybe they're gifts that I can use to help make the world better." "Your mom is absolutely right," Margaret said. "And judging by this celebration, you're already making the world better just by being yourself and helping other people understand that different doesn't mean less than." As Margaret stood and looked around the gymnasium, she began to notice details that filled her heart with hope. Brandon Weber was standing next to Tommy's display, enthusiastically explaining to younger children how Tommy's brain processed information. Sarah Chun was at another booth, sharing her own struggles with anxiety and how she had learned coping strategies. Emma Rodriguez was leading a group of kindergartners in a sensory activity designed to help them understand how different textures and sounds affect people differently. Mrs. Martinez rejoined them, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of joy mixed with exhaustion that Margaret recognized as the look of a parent who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes to make something special happen for her child. "This is incredible," Margaret said to her. "How did you coordinate all of this?" "Honestly, I didn't coordinate most of it," Mrs. Martinez replied. "After that day in the hallway, word spread through the parent network faster than I could have imagined. Mrs. Weber started making phone calls. Other parents began sharing their own stories. And before we knew it, we had families volunteering to participate, who I'd never even met." She pointed to a display across the room featuring a fifth-grade girl named Maya. Maya has been struggling with dyslexia for years, but she's also an incredible artist. Her parents had been so focused on helping her with her reading challenges that they hadn't really celebrated her artistic gifts. When they heard about our event, they realized it was time to highlight both aspects of who Maya is. Margaret walked over to Maya's display and was struck by the beautiful paintings and sketches, created by someone whose brain processed written language differently. The display included examples of Maya's schoolwork, showing her reading struggles, but also showcased her visual art that demonstrated complex understanding of color, theory, composition, and emotional expression. Maya herself was standing proudly next to her display, explaining to a group of adults how she had learned to use drawing and visualization techniques to help her remember spelling patterns and math concepts. "The really amazing thing," Mrs. Martinez continued as they moved through the displays, "is how many neurotypical children have been inspired by this too. They're starting to understand that everyone has strengths and challenges, and that empathy and inclusion make our whole community stronger." As if to illustrate her point, Margaret noticed a group of children from various grade levels clustered around a hands-on activity station. They were working together on a puzzle that required different types of thinking: visual spatial reasoning, logical sequencing, pattern recognition, and creative problem-solving. Some children excelled at certain aspects while struggling with others, and Margaret watched as they naturally began helping each other based on their individual strengths. "Mrs. Collins." Margaret turned to see Mrs. Henderson, the regular third-grade teacher, approaching with a warm smile. She looked fully recovered from her bout with the flu, but more than that, she looked energized and excited. "I can't thank you enough for what you did during my absence," Mrs. Henderson said. "The changes in my classroom dynamic have been remarkable. Tommy is more confident. The other children are more inclusive. And honestly, I've learned so much about different learning styles and needs." She gestured toward Tommy, who was now demonstrating a math concept to a mixed-age group of children using colored blocks and rhythmic patterns. "I've started incorporating more movement and sensory elements into my lessons, and it's benefiting all of my students, not just Tommy. Test scores are up, but more importantly, engagement and enthusiasm are through the roof." Margaret watched Tommy's demonstration with fascination. He was explaining multiplication using a combination of visual arrays, physical movement, and musical rhythm that made the concept accessible to children with various learning preferences. Even the adults watching were nodding along, clearly gaining new insights into mathematical relationships. The district office has asked me to develop a training program for other teachers based on what we've learned. Mrs. Henderson continued. They want to implement inclusive teaching strategies throughout all our elementary schools, and they've asked if you would be willing to co-facilitate the training sessions. Margaret felt a familiar flutter of excitement that came with new challenges and opportunities to make a difference. I would be honored to be part of that. There's more, Principal Johnson said, joining their conversation. The State Education Department has heard about our neurodiversity celebration and our improved inclusive practices. They're considering Roosevelt Elementary as a pilot site for a new statewide initiative on supporting twice exceptional students. As the celebration continued around them, Margaret found herself reflecting on how one moment of moral courage had created ripples that were still expanding. She had simply refused to let a child be marginalized and dismissed, and that single act of advocacy had grown into a community-wide transformation. Later that afternoon, as the event was winding down, Margaret found herself sitting on a bench in the school courtyard with Tommy and his mother. The late October sun was warm on their faces, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from the playground. "Mrs. Collins," Tommy said, "I have something for you." He handed her a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was a book, not a published book, but a handmade one with construction paper covers and pages filled with Tommy's careful handwriting and detailed illustrations. "I wrote this for you," Tommy said. "It's called The Teacher Who Saw Me. It's about how one person believing in someone can change everything." Margaret opened the book and began reading. The story was sophisticated beyond Tommy's chronological age, filled with metaphors about light breaking through darkness and seeds growing in unexpected soil. But more than that, it was a story about hope, understanding, and the power of human connection. "Tommy, this is beautiful," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are going to change the world with gifts like this." "I hope so," Tommy said seriously. "I want other kids like me to know that they're not alone, and that their differences are actually superpowers in disguise." Mrs. Martinez put her arm around her son. "You know, Mrs. Collins, 6 months ago Tommy was having panic attacks about going to school. He felt stupid and broken and alone. Today, he stood in front of a gymnasium full of people and confidently explained how his brain works. That transformation didn't happen because we fixed Tommy. It happened because people like you helped the world see Tommy for who he really is." As Margaret drove home that evening, she thought about the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple substitute teaching assignment. She had walked into a classroom expecting to manage lesson plans and behavioral issues. Instead, she had become part of a story about seeing beyond surface differences to recognize the unique gifts that every child brings to the world. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When she read it, she smiled and had to pull over to wipe away tears. "Mrs. Collins, this is Brandon Weber. My mom gave me your number. I wanted to thank you for teaching us that different is wonderful. Tommy helped me with my science project today, and I helped him understand why some of the other kids were scared of his stims. We make a good team. Peace. I'm going to ask my mom if Tommy can come to my birthday party next month." Margaret sat in her car for several minutes, overwhelmed by the beauty of children's capacity for growth and change when given the right guidance and support. She thought about all the Tommies in classrooms across the country who were still waiting for someone to see their potential instead of just their challenges. She thought about all the Brandons who needed help understanding that diversity makes communities stronger, not weaker. Most of all, she thought about the power of one voice speaking up for what's right, and how that voice can inspire others to find their own courage to advocate for understanding and inclusion. When Margaret finally arrived home, she found an email waiting for her from the State Education Department. The subject line read, "Consultant Position, Statewide Neurodiversity Initiative." She opened the email and read about an opportunity to travel to schools across the state, training teachers and administrators in inclusive practices and helping communities develop their own neurodiversity celebrations. The position would be demanding, requiring extensive travel and the development of new curriculum materials, but it would also allow her to share Tommy's story and the lessons learned at Roosevelt Elementary with thousands of educators and families. Margaret didn't hesitate. She typed her acceptance immediately. 6 months later, Margaret stood in front of a packed auditorium at the state education conference. Behind her was a large screen displaying a photo of Tommy at the Roosevelt Elementary Neurodiversity Celebration, surrounded by his classmates and smiling confidently at the camera. When I walked into Roosevelt Elementary that October morning, Margaret told the audience of educators, parents, and policymakers, I thought I was just covering for a sick teacher. I had no idea I was about to meet a child who would change my understanding of what it means to be gifted, what it means to be different, and what it means to truly see and value every student who walks through our classroom doors. She clicked to the next slide, which showed test score improvements, behavioral incident reductions, and parent satisfaction increases from schools that had implemented the Neurodiversity Initiative. But the real measure of success, Margaret continued, isn't found in data points or statistics. It's found in children who no longer hide their differences, but celebrate them. It's found in classrooms where stimming is understood as self-regulation rather than disruption. It's found in communities where twice exceptional children are seen as doubly blessed rather than doubly challenged. The final slide appeared, a photo of Tommy, now in 4th grade, leading a science club for younger students. In the photo, he was surrounded by children of all neurological profiles, all engaged in building a model of the solar system together. Tommy Martinez taught me that when we defend one child's right to be understood and accepted, we create space for all children to thrive. When we challenge our assumptions about what giftedness looks like, what disability means, and what normal should be, we open doors to possibilities we never imagined. Margaret paused and looked out at the sea of faces in the auditorium. Each of you has the power to be that voice of advocacy in a child's life. Each of you can choose to see potential instead of problems, gifts instead of deficits, and possibilities instead of limitations. The question isn't whether you'll encounter children who learn differently. You will. The question is whether you'll be the adult who helps them understand that different is not less than, but simply different. The auditorium erupted in sustained applause. Margaret watched as hundreds of educators rose to their feet, many wiping away tears, others nodding with a recognition that comes from seeing familiar struggles through a new lens. After her presentation, Margaret was surrounded by teachers, parents, and administrators sharing their own stories of twice exceptional children, of students who had been misunderstood, and of the small moments of advocacy that had created transformative change in their communities. But the conversation that stayed with her most was with a young teacher named Jessica, who approached her near the end of the day. "Senora Collins," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I might be like Tommy." Margaret looked at the young woman with fresh eyes. Jessica appeared to be in her late 20s, with an earnest expression and hands that moved expressively as she spoke. "I was never diagnosed as a child, but listening to your presentation, so many things clicked into place. I was always the fidgety kid, the one who knew the answers but couldn't sit still during tests. I struggled socially, but excelled academically. I became a teacher because I wanted to help children who felt different, but I never understood that I might be one of those children myself." Margaret nodded encouragingly. Many adults are discovering their neurodivergent identities later in life, especially women and people of color who are often overlooked by the diagnostic systems of previous decades. "I've been teaching for 5 years," Jessica continued, "and I've always been drawn to the students who remind me of myself at that age. But now I'm wondering if I could be an even better advocate for them. If I better understood my own neurological differences, self-awareness can certainly enhance our ability to support others." Margaret agreed. "Have you considered seeking an evaluation?" Jessica nodded. "I'm planning to. But more than that, I'm thinking about how to create a classroom environment where children like Tommy and Likney can thrive from the beginning, rather than having to overcome years of misunderstanding first." That conversation sparked an idea that Margaret hadn't anticipated. Over the following months, as she traveled to schools across the state, she began collecting stories, not just from students and families, but from educators who had their own experiences with She met teachers with ADHD who brought unprecedented energy and creativity to their classrooms, administrators with autism who excelled at systematic thinking and attention to detail, and counselors with learning differences who had deep empathy for struggling students. These stories became part of her presentations, helping to break down the artificial divide between normal educators and different students. The message became clear. Neurodiversity wasn't something that happened to other people's children. It was a natural part of the human experience that touched every family and every classroom in some way. Meanwhile, back at Roosevelt Elementary, Tommy's story continued to unfold in remarkable ways. Now, in 5th grade, he had become something of a celebrity in the local education community. His mother regularly received calls from other schools asking if Tommy would be willing to speak to their students about neurodiversity and self-advocacy. But perhaps more significantly, Tommy had inspired a new generation of young advocates. His former classmates, now spread across different grade levels, had become leaders in promoting inclusion and understanding. Brendan Veva had started a peer mentorship program pairing neurotypical students with twice exceptional younger children. Sarah Chun had developed a school-wide anxiety support group that helped students learn coping strategies together. Emma Rodriguez had become fluent in basic sign language and was teaching other students to communicate with a new deaf student who had enrolled at the school. Margaret made it a point to visit Roosevelt Elementary whenever she was in town, and each visit revealed new layers of the transformation that had begun with one moment of moral courage in a 3rd-grade hallway. During one such visit in the spring of Thomas' 5th grade year, she found him in the library, working with Mrs. Patterson, the school librarian, on what appeared to be a complex research project. "Mrs. Collins?" Tommy called out when he saw her. "Come see what I'm working on." He was surrounded by books about neuroscience, psychology, and education, along with a laptop displaying what looked like the beginning of a formal research proposal. "I'm designing a study," Tommy explained with the same enthusiasm he had always shown for learning. "I want to research how different sensory accommodations affect the academic performance of twice exceptional students. Mrs. Patterson is helping me understand how to structure a proper literature review." Margaret looked at the sophistication of his work and then at Mrs. Patterson, who was beaming with pride. "Tommy approached me last month with this idea," Mrs. Patterson explained. He'd been thinking about his own learning experiences and wondering if what helped him might help other students too. The depth of his thinking about research methodology is remarkable for someone his age. "I want to present my findings at the middle school science fair next year," Tommy continued, "and maybe, eventually, at real conferences like the ones you speak at. Mrs. Collins, I think students should have a voice in research about students." Margaret felt that familiar flutter of amazement at Tommy's insights and ambitions. But she also felt something else, a deep sense of satisfaction at seeing him advocate not just for himself, but for other children who shared similar experiences. "That's brilliant, Tommy. Student voice in educational research is incredibly important and often overlooked. Mrs. Martinez mentioned that you might be willing to be my mentor for this project," Tommy said hopefully. "I know you're busy traveling to schools, but I could work around your schedule." Margaret didn't hesitate. "I would be honored to mentor you, Tommy. This research could make a real difference for twice exceptional students everywhere." As they discussed the project further, Margaret realized that Tommy's evolution from a misunderstood 3rd-grader to a confident 5th-grade researcher and advocate represented something profound about the potential that exists in every child when they're given appropriate support and understanding. But the story took another unexpected turn when Margaret received a call from Dr. Amanda Chun, the director of the state's gifted education program and Sarah Chun's aunt. "Senora Collins, I have an unusual request," Dr. Chun said. "We've been following the success of the Neurodiversity Initiative you've been leading, and we're particularly interested in the Roosevelt Elementary model. We'd like to propose creating a documentary film about Tommy's story and the broader implications for education policy." Margaret was intrigued, but cautious. What kind of documentary? Something that could be used for professional development with educators nationwide. "We'd want to follow Tommy and several other twice exceptional students through a school year, documenting not just their challenges, but their remarkable abilities. The goal would be to create a resource that helps teachers understand what twice exceptional actually looks like in the classroom." The idea was compelling, but Margaret knew the decision ultimately belonged to Tommy and his family. When she presented the opportunity to Mrs. Martinez, the response was immediate and surprising. "We'd love to participate," Mrs. Martinez said without hesitation. "Tommy has been talking about wanting to help other children understand that they're not alone. This could reach children and families we'd never be able to connect with otherwise." Tommy's response was equally enthusiastic. "Could we include other kids too, like Maya and Herath, and that boy from Jefferson Elementary who builds incredible robots but struggles with handwriting?" The documentary project, titled Different and Wonderful, The Twice Exceptional Experience, became a year-long collaboration involving students, families, educators, and researchers from across the state. Margaret served as an educational consultant, helping to ensure that the film accurately represented both the challenges and the incredible potential of twice exceptional learners. The film followed 5 children through their school experiences: Tommy with his autism and intellectual gift, Maya with her dyslexia and artistic talents, Alex, a middle schooler with ADHD and remarkable engineering abilities, Sophie, a high schooler with anxiety disorders and exceptional literary gifts, and Marcus, an elementary student who was nonverbal but communicated through technology and demonstrated profound mathematical understanding. But the most powerful part of the documentary wasn't the individual stories. It was the footage of these children teaching each other and advocating for themselves and their peers. The film captured Tommy explaining sensory processing to younger students, Maya showing how she used art to overcome reading challenges, and Alex designing assistive technology for students with different abilities. When the documentary premiered at the National Education Conference the following year, it received a standing ovation from an audience of 3,000 educators. But more importantly, it sparked conversations in school districts across the country about how to better identify and support twice exceptional learners. Margaret, now officially serving as the state's Director of Neurodiversity Education Initiatives, watched the premiere from the back of the auditorium. As the credits rolled and showed updates on each of the featured students, she felt a profound sense of completion and new beginning at the same time. The final credits showed Tommy, now in 6th grade, standing in front of a classroom of teachers presenting his research on sensory accommodations. The caption read, "Tommy Martinez continues to advocate for twice exceptional students and plans to become an educational He says his goal is to help create schools where no child ever feels broken or alone." As the lights came up and the audience began to disperse, Margaret felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find a young woman with tears in her eyes. "Excuse me? Are you Margaret Collins?" Margaret nodded. "My name is Dr. Lisa Wong. I'm a pediatric psychologist specializing in twice exceptional children. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done to raise awareness about these incredible kids." She paused, gathering her thoughts. 20 years ago, I was a lot like Tommy, autistic, gifted, and completely misunderstood by my teachers. I struggled through school, feeling like I was broken and stupid, despite having a genius-level IQ. If I had had an advocate like you in my elementary classroom, my educational experience would have been completely different. Margaret felt tears welling in her own eyes. "Thank you for sharing that with me. And thank you for the work you're doing now to help other children." "Actually," Dr. Wong continued, "I have a proposal for you. I've been invited to speak at the International Conference on Twice Exceptional Learners in Geneva next year. Would you be willing to co-present with me? I think your perspective as an educator, combined with my clinical experience, could create a powerful message about the importance of advocacy and understanding." As Margaret agreed to the collaboration, she realized that Tommy's story had grown far beyond anything she could have imagined that October morning when she first walked into his classroom. What had started as one substitute teacher defending one misunderstood child had become a movement that was changing educational practices around the world. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came later that evening, when her phone buzzed with a text message from Tommy himself. "Mrs. Collins, I saw the documentary premiere on the live. Thank you for helping me understand that my differences aren't something to hide or fix. They're part of what makes me who I am. And who I am is someone who can help make the world more understanding and kind. I hope other kids watching will know they're not alone, and that different really is wonderful." Margaret smiled as she typed her response. "Tommy, you've taught me that when we see children for who they truly are, rather than who we think they should be, We don't just change their lives, we change our own. Thank you for being exactly who you are." As she put her phone away and looked out at the city lights beyond her hotel window, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had spent decades as a substitute teacher, moving from classroom to classroom, school to school, always making a difference, but never quite finding her true calling. Now, at 65 years old, she had discovered that her life's work wasn't about teaching curriculum or managing behavior. It was about seeing the extraordinary in the seemingly ordinary, finding the gifts hidden beneath the challenges, and refusing to let any child be diminished by the limitations of others' understanding. The next morning, as Margaret prepared to fly home, she received one final message that brought everything full circle. It was from Mrs. Henderson, Tommy's former third-grade teacher. "Margaret, I wanted you to know that our classroom has been designated as a demonstration site for inclusive education practices. Teachers come from all over the state to observe how we integrate sensory supports, flexible seating, and multiple learning modalities into daily instruction. Every visitor asks about the day you stood up for Tommy in our hallway, and I tell them that sometimes the most important lesson we can teach is that every child deserves to be seen, understood, and valued. Thank you for showing us what that looks like in practice." Margaret settled into her airplane seat with a deep sense of gratitude and anticipation. Tommy's story had taught her that when we choose courage over comfort, understanding over judgment, and hope over fear, we create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or measure. But, more than that, it had shown her that the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest acts of human decency. Seeing a child who feels invisible, believing in potential that others dismiss, and refusing to accept that different means less than. As the plane lifted off, and the landscape spread out below her, Margaret thought about all the Tommies in classrooms around the world who were still waiting for someone to see their light. She thought about the teachers who needed support to understand neurodiversity, the parents who were advocating tirelessly for their children, and the communities that were ready to embrace a broader definition of human potential. Most of all, she thought about the power of one voice raised in defense of what's right, and how that voice can inspire others to find their own courage to create change. The substitute teacher who had walked into Roosevelt Elementary that October morning thinking she was just covering for a sick colleague had discovered her true calling, helping the world understand that our differences aren't obstacles to overcome, but gifts to celebrate. And Tommy Martinez, the boy who had once felt broken and alone, had become proof that when children are seen for who they truly are, there's no limit to what they can achieve or how they can change the world around them. The story that began with one moment of moral courage had become a legacy of understanding, acceptance, and hope that would continue to ripple outward for generations to come.